Marvin Zuckerman, Professor Emeritus from the University of Delaware. Sensory deprivations where you put people in dark, soundproof rooms or water tanks, and people are becoming aware that we needed sensation, stimulation, variation stimulation, almost as much as we need food and water and so forth. It's a basic need. And deprivation of this kind of stimulation led to some very uncomfortable states. So we ask, is there a personality trait that some people need more stimulation or more variety or intensity of stimulation than others? And that's when we developed our first sensation-seeking scale. And subsequently that expanded, became the main focus of my research, is we were surprised by how many things were affected by this trait, sensation-seeking. And then we got interested in the biological basis, the genetic and biological basis. And here again we had some very interesting findings pointing to the fact that this is a very fundamental trait with biological roots. Well, this is determined from twin studies called biometrics of behavior genetics, actually. Using these twin studies, we initially found that roughly 60%, the heritability is the proportion of the variance in a trait that's determined by genetics. And we discovered there was 60%, which is very high for a personality trait, which generally run between 30 and 50%. So 60% is high for a personality trait, although it's higher for intelligence and some other traits. More recently, this was established not only using twins raised together, but twins raised apart, showing that it wasn't due to the fact of sharing a stimulating environment, let's say. There is an environmental aspect to this of the remaining 40%. Some is error of measurement, but some of it is due to environment. But it's not the shared, what we call the shared environment, shared in the family. It's due to the non-shared environment, which means your friends, peers, your unique life experiences that you have that other people in your family, you don't share with other people in your family. We can surmise that, particularly since a particular gene has been found to be related to sensation-seeking, a dopamine receptor gene. So that means it's been there a long time. Well, actually, they estimate that it's not old evolution, maybe 50,000, 100,000 years old in our species, this particular gene. But there may be other genes that are older even. But you see this in the point is you see what we might call analogs of sensation-seeking behavior in other species. In fact, a lot of my work has compared sensation-seeking expressions, exploration, approach to novelty in other species with the same, and explored this to the extent that they have the same biological roots in humans and in other species. So in that sense, we look at evolution, we have a modern test of evolution when you can find something that exists in humans in earlier species, particularly primates, I might say, but also even in rats, when you can find this, and it's linked to the same biological indicators in both species, in both humans and other animals. That indicates it has a evolutionary history. Rather, it's more than merely an analogy. Oh, this looks like what we do, but it's more than that. It's the fact that it looks like sensation-seeking and has the same biological roots. I would say the age differences are somewhat larger if you're looking at the extremes. I would say like at about 60, 65, a male would have half the sensation-seeking score that he had when he was in his late teens or early 20s. So that's pretty much of a decline. The male-female differences are constant across age, but perhaps not as large. When we talk about sex differences, in traits, we're always talking about a lot of overlap. We're talking about population differences. So people always say, I know someone who's, female but is very high sensation seeking. Of course, there's variation within both genders. It's just the overall population difference is different. Well, we found that it's genetic in both, but males are almost always higher on the general trait, and particularly on those subscales that deal with impulsivity, like we call them disinhibition, for instance, one scale, and another thrill and adventure seeking. These are things men are particularly high on. These are things also that peak in adolescence and decline with age. So that's an interesting thing, because sensation seeking also peaks in adolescence. It's higher in men than women. Peaks in adolescence, like late adolescence, and declines with age. Well, in the past, sensation seeking was found in just the struggle for survival, hunting. I imagine the successful hunters were men who enjoyed it, even at the risk of hunting large mammals, mammoths and things like that. War has always been fighting among men. It still is related to sensation seeking. But in modern Western society, where there's no war, most people find their sensation in other kinds of activities. For instance, thrill and adventure seeking. Well, ordinary sports don't provide much of that. Exceptional sports like skydiving and hang gliding and whitewater rafting and things like that provide the sensation, thrill and adventure seeking, for a minority of people who engage in them. Your average man, for instance, finds his sensation seeking the way he drives his car, and we find the high sensation seekers are more risky drivers. They drive at higher speeds. Young males have more accidents. They tailgate. They use their cars as a vehicle for thrill and adventure seeking and aggression.
Now, do you think that...
But I want to add to that.
Sure.
Sensation seeking isn't all thrill and adventure seeking. Sensation seeking has outlets through there's other aspects through sex, for instance, which is part of the reason for its survival. It was involved in seeking of mates, and some men and women need a lot of variety in their sexual outlets and behavior, and others don't need that much variety, and therefore are more monogamous. And so that's in one area. Drinking, drugs, partying, these are all outlets for sensation seekers, okay, involving different kinds of risk, but involving risk nevertheless. Well, there is 4 types of risk-taking which form the core, you might say, of smoking, drinking, drugs, and sex. Okay. Now you can see 3 of those are substance abuses, and they act through the central nervous system. They act on centers in the central nervous system that give intrinsic pleasure. Okay, particularly stimulant drugs like cocaine. They provide pleasure. They provide the kick that activities provide, like sex provide, for the sensation seeker, and they're all correlated because they're all aspects of intensity-seeking sensation. Okay, and then novelty too. There's a difference, for instance, in drug users between those who are high sensation seekers and those who are low. I found this out when I was treating drug abusers. The low sensation drug abuser tries one drug which he enjoys particularly and sticks to it. The lows try many different drugs, so then invariably they get into odd drugs like LSD that affect their minds as well as they provide unusual sensations as well as arousal. Okay. The lows stay away from those drugs. I remember once sitting around in a discussion in this drug abusing community, and they were relating their drug experiences, And one of them was a high sensation-seeking LSD user, and he was talking about and another one was shaking his head. And they asked him, Joe, why are you, what do you think of this? He says, man, that's crazy. This is a heroin abuser, you understand? Why would anyone fool with that? That's dangerous. You fuck with your mind, he just couldn't understand it. He just used heroin, which, which initially provides some highs, but eventually is used because it's because of the lows. It just, because you need it to stay feeling normal. Okay. You find, for instance, that high sensation seekers, there are not many men who love war and combat, but there are a few, there are some who really find that exciting and will re-volunteer simply because they're bored with military life outside of combat. Okay? And they're in various substances which are interesting in that they stimulate the same centers that are stimulated by intense and novel external stimulation. Drugs do that more directly, particularly drugs like cocaine. There is, particularly for one type of sensation seeking, we call it experience seeking, seeking sensation through the mind and the senses, one type of experience seeking. And high sensation seekers are more prone to engage in divergent thinking. They don't think in the conventional ways. They tend to think along unconventional lines. And this is a part of creativity. Creativity is the ability to think and do things in a way that haven't been done before. Part of novelty seeking, you might say. So, in a sense, they tend to be more creative if they have ability to be creative. And we think of creativity, we think of abilities. Many of the people who on the streets who are drug dealers are very creative. They're creative criminally. They think of new ways of doing the things, but we don't call that creativity, even though it is creativity. So it depends on if you have the ability to pursue your divergent thinking along lines that will result in a production of something, whether it's in business or art or science, you have the ability, plus the sensation seeking, that makes you more creative in what you're doing. Well, actually, there is no relationship between sensation seeking and neuroticism or anxiety. You might think that's funny because they seem to lack fear, but the kind of fear they lack is fear of physical harm. Neuroticism anxiety is based on a different kind of fear, mostly social fear, and they don't differ on that. They're independent. That's an independent trait in neuroticism. So you find as many high sensation seekers are high as are low, and most are average in neuroticism. It's that physical fear that they differ on. That high sensation seekers tend to, first of all, see things as less risky than lows. If you ask them, see even something they've never tried before. If you say, how risky is this? The highs are going to say it's riskier. And then when they do it, they demonstrate less fear arousal, because fear arousal makes something unpleasant. Those who are not that high in sensation seeking, they may get to try it under peer pressure or something, and then they find that they're tremendous, even though no harm comes to them, they find it an unpleasant experience because of the fear that it arouses. So they'll never do it again. They say, okay, I've done that, I'm not going to do it again. Whereas the highs value that kind of, whatever fear they felt, just gave a little kick to the experience. It made it even more pleasurable, oddly enough, because it was fearful. They overcame the fear and they experienced pleasure. Well, there's a thing that happens with sensation seeking, habituation. Habituation is a basic law of learning, the lowest organisms. When you expose them to something repeatedly, over and over, they respond less to it. They're less aroused by it, even though initially it was arousing. When they get used to it, and nothing happens, nothing particular happens, they get less aroused. Now, in violence or in sex, this occurs too. habituation, So what was initially very arousing, let's say in sex, the honeymoon, with time becomes still pleasurable but less arousing. And that's why the high sensation seekers have to look for new sources of arousal. Now this occurs in films too. You start out with simple horror films, and the high sensation seeker says, "Oh, yeah, that's fine," but he gets bored by it, and so when they're allowed to, by legally, and recently the society has loosened about its laws about depiction of violence and sex in the media, so they keep pushing it to the extreme, because they find that people, as high sensation seekers become habituated, they become bored with it and they need something more. They go to something that's more exciting. Same thing in thrill seeking, for instance. Skydivers, they find that initially very exciting, and that's why they like it, the high sensation. But then they become used to it, so they have to do new things, like they do the stunting and things like this, group things, and then that becomes boring. And some of them go on to even more dangerous forms, like base jumping. Do you know what base jumping is? Base jumping is you jump not from an airplane, but from a cliff or a building even, or when it's something where you have very little time to open your parachute. Timing is very important, and a lot more people die at that sort of parachuting. Okay, and yet why do they do it? Because it's really more exciting. It's because the fact that they have less time. It's not that they do it. They become habituated to less arousing forms for them now. Less arousing forms. So that's why everything tends to escalate in the sensation-seeking field, from from lesser expressions to sometimes more dangerous expressions. Well, what was happening psychologically? They're just becoming bored and restless if they were high sensation seekers. If they were low sensation seekers, they weren't too. They were fairly comfortable, unless they had high anxiety trait. They were. We measured actually how much they would move around. We could actually measure their restlessness. At the beginning, first 3 hours, there was no difference. But as time went on, the highs became more and more restless, twitching, turning, on the bed. They began to sing to themselves, even though they knew they weren't supposed to speak or stimulate themselves. They began to stimulate themselves. So that was the expression of it. If you go a long period, what's happening in the brain is over longer periods of time, even over shorter periods, is that the brain waves are slowing down. The basic arousal patterns in the brain, the alpha waves, are getting slower, okay? And that, to most people, is unpleasant. I mean, to go below your optimal level of arousal for any prolonged period of time becomes unpleasant. And if you give them any kind of stimulation in sensory deprivation, even looking at meaningless blotches of color, they will avidly press a bar to do that. In other words, they're being deprived of something. Variety of stimulation. And when you deprive people of that, that is very aversive to them. Okay, it's one of the ways of torture, actually, of putting people. It's not just the social and sensory deprivation when you put someone, it's the sensory deprivation. You put people in an environment, they may not be under sensory deprivation, but if nothing is varying in their sensory environment, it is becoming increasingly aversive. No, it's not humane, and it's not, over solitary confinement, it's called, in prisons, when they want to punish them, they put them in solitary confinement, which is usually a sensory deprivation as well, because even if there's light in the cell, there's no variation, okay, nothing is changing, no one to talk to. Part of social isolation is the lack of social stimulation, okay. So this is, over time, is very torturous, you might say. It's a mental torture of a sort can be very effective. The torturers often usually isolate their prisoners before they begin interrogating them, because then they respond the tendency to respond to any stimulation, even interrogation, is more primed by the sensory deprivation. Well, as I say, it came out of a natural course out of my research in sensory deprivation, which is the opposite of sensation seeking. But I must admit, perhaps I was at the time in my life, I looked at people, friends who are high sensation seekers, and I looked at them with some kind of, I used them as kind of a prototype when I was designing this trait. Thought, well, what are the things they do? What do they like? As a kind of prototype for writing items for my scale. Now, it didn't, of course, it went, we had other ways than once we had these items. But you have to have the idea. It was a new idea for a trait. It was a new, which no one was really measuring at that time. Okay, so to get my idea, I looked around me at, and what people were doing, and I said, in the first form of this test, we depended on, we say, would you like to do this? Like, would you like to do parachute skydiving, because we assume most people aren't doing it. But the mere thought they would like to do it is something that characterizes a higher sensation seeker. Okay, whereas a lower sensation, no, that's crazy. Why would I want to do that? That's dangerous. So in what people might like to do, well, it's our first items for our thrill and adventure seeking subscale. Okay, then we ask, well, what about what are the other aspects? And we looked at sex, drugs, and we asked questions about, would you like to do this? Would you like to do that? Or in the case of sex, what do you like to do? Or what are your attitudes toward? Are they permissive attitudes? Those are the sort of things that we looked at. So that's how I got the initial items. Now, we have different kinds of items now that don't include content, just the need for excitement. Well, I would say to be a publishing professor teaching, you can't be too high, because if you're too high, you're out doing other things. You're not doing research and writing. So, but I would say I was higher than the average professor. Okay. Now recently that became a moot point when they discovered this gene, the dopamine 4 receptor gene. And I was in England. By this time I was getting on in age. It was my last sabbatical. But I had the chance, I was in the genetics lab there, and I had the chance to have my own DNA examined for the presence of this particular gene, the form of the gene. So I did, and I found I had the long form of the gene, which is the type associated with sensation seeking. But as I explained to my colleagues there, my sensation seeking by the time you're 60, my sensation seeking was confined to riding the top of the double-decker bus in London, because age, you may have a gene for something, but its expression is affected by other biological factors related to age, normally, like the rise in MAO with age, which reduces sensation seeking.